Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Takedown, Subverting Power, Radical Thought. I'm your host, Nick Nowlin, and I'm joined by Richard. Introduce yourself, Richard.
Hey everyone, Richard here. Progressive, or actually, no, I'm not Progressive Grease on Twitter anymore. Now I am Road to Revolution. I thought that was a more apt moniker for what I'm doing, learning liberation, the tag, and just working hard on learning a lot about that. And so I'm really happy for this show. We're gonna be talking about some interesting things today with Nick, and so take it away, Nick.
All right. There's a lot of things that have happened over the past month since we've done our last episode. We had the 200th anniversary of the birth of Marx, Karl Marx. This is the person who wrote Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3. Very, very important reading for left wing thought. Now, I'm not saying, 100% everything in there is the Bible, but I do think one of Marx's greatest contributions is the ability to, without any kind of metrics, without any type of like hard data like what we have today, he was able to intuitively figure out sort of like the greater tendencies and motions of capitalism, and then like provide a framework whereby you can critique capitalism and its greater motions, and like kind of like how it looks systemically, like literally that is his greatest contribution. And it is one of the reasons why, like, here we are, 140 years or 160 years later, like people are still reading, Capital 1, 2, and 3. They're still reading that to try to understand intuitively some of the things that he understood back at that time. And that's also why, as far as philosophy is concerned, he's probably one of the most widely read world around the world as far as philosophy is concerned, because it's just that critical that we understand, kind of like how our society is going, what capitalism is, and kind of how it moves and how it rotates on a grand scale. Because a lot of times those larger movements are just they're just abstract. We can't really see them. We can't really touch them. We're kind of stuck in our own little daily lives as one little cog in a much larger system. He was able to basically come up with a framework to kind of look at that in a more systemic sense. So I think he deserves recognition for that. We
Yeah,
also had go ahead.
oh, I was just going to say, to kind of build on that, zoomed out perspective on capitalism, whereas it seems for a lot of people, myself included, it's often hard to visualize or think of capitalism from outside of it. And when you look at it or think of it from outside, it allows you that perspective that you were describing, that allows you to encapsulate the whole system and describe functions of the system as a system rather than individual actors within the system. And I think that was critical. And to the point that you were making about deserving recognition, it seems as though a lot of people have conflated Marx with a lot of other contemporaries or people that came after him that might have pointed towards some of his philosophies and may have used them in different ways than he may have imagined. But go ahead, continue.
Well, I mean, I really would like to just keep in mind that, like, you know, Marx's critique of capitalism was basically a framework for how to critique capitalism. It wasn't necessarily a blueprint for how you should do things, but like you can use that critique to try to do something different. I think that's may have been kind of where people kind of go wrong. They're like, okay, you know, Marx wrote this in his book. It's like, no. Marx wrote a critique of capitalism, and then other people took it and tried to do something different, for better or for worse. And a large variety of things happen, when they try to set about these things. So it's not necessarily Marx's teachings that are incorrect, and it may not have been, what they individually tried to do, that claim to hail from Marx. It may not have been, their individual failings or their collective failings that brought about, good or bad results. It could be a mixture of multiple things, because the world is very complex, and it's too simple to say they fail because the ideology, or they fail because the teachings, or they fail because their objectives are wrong or undoable or impossible. That's just not how it works. But I don't want to stay on Marx for too long. I'm probably going to have a Marxist economist on with us at some point. I've been meaning to have him on for quite some time, but his schedule is quite erratic, and then mine being what it is, my schedule's kind of erratic as well. I also want to say we had the birthday of Malcolm X. We had his birthday over this past weekend, and I think Malcolm was a giant in terms of you know steering Black radical thought towards self-reliance, self-reliance, self determination, and self defense. Like I think he was a giant in kind of pushing that, and instead of always, people have this kind of like a deference or a fear of white people. I think, generally speaking, Malcolm kind of really helped usher in a wave of radicals that just weren't afraid. And I think that that's something that we definitely have to move to reclaim.
Yeah, and
You
I
know?
think though the language of the self defense and self all the selves that you mentioned, it wasn't the self in the sense of the individual self, but the self as a community, and I think that's an important distinction that could be lost in the language. But I think as the points that you make and were very important and critical at the time, because if you if go ahead, there's a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, we could do shows on those two names, guys. Like,
Oh, yeah.
we could do shows on those two names, and like, I try to get a bird's eye view and not go into detail, and basically, just end up having diarrhea of the mouth, just spewing knowledge and information on any one particular subject. I try to get a bird's eye view, so basically, everybody who may or may not have read a lot of stuff, they can come in and kind of, oh, he was talking about something here. Maybe I should go back and read that and have a better understanding. And I think Malcolm X, he's done a lot of interviews and there's a lot of videos of him speaking where you can actually go back and listen. I think, something that I think about when I think about it is he gave a speech where he talked about black leaders and white liberals. And I think that is, you can just take that speech and you can just plug it right in today and it still applies. It's very poignant.
And one of the other things I think
Right.
Malcolm provides is an example of growth of a person. That Malcolm wasn't always the same person that we think of when we think of Malcolm, and different people think of different Malcolms, I think. But grew up on the streets in a lot of ways, and was a hustler in a lot of ways, and spent time at the Nation of Islam, and eventually, we see that him and Martin Luther King seem to be growing closer together. Both Martin Luther King coming closer to him, and him coming closer to Martin Luther King Jr. In a lot of different ways philosophically, and as far as action as well, both with radicalization for MLK and with a turn towards alternative social structures or coalition building that Malcolm started to be more endorsement or be more welcoming of towards the end of his life. And uh, there's just a lot there, and one of the places that I advise people to look, and whatever, shameless plug, Left POC, the project with Wendy Muse, and currently working with myself as well on the Reading Revolution project, where we're reading old texts or texts from revolutionaries, primarily focused on revolutionaries of the past of color, but we talked a lot about some writings from Lenin and that in Marx as well in the last episode. So check out that at Left POC, and you can find out more there, or the hashtag Reading Revolution. But with that, let us move on, Nick.
All right. I think we kind of did our duty to make sure we cover things of that kind of importance. We don't just let them pass without at least saying something about them. I guess the topic I really want to talk about today was there was a report released by Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton, and basically it's a report that examines kind of like how the discourse around the racialized wealth gap. Like I've talked about racial inequality and I've talked about wealth inequality, but like the thing is, we kind of talk about them as if they're separate things. But I think this report, it's a 67-page report, by the way, and Darity and Hamilton are not the only people on it. Antonio Moore, Atlanta Ja, Ann Price, Mark Paul. There's some other notable names. Antonio Moore does videos, so I think he has a lot more to say about other things. But he's also mentioned in this report, like he actually wrote some of it, the important parts, especially when dealing with black celebrity. But the thing I want to talk about is there's a lot of stuff in here about the racial wealth gap, and like basically it starts off by saying, the 10 things that we get wrong about the racial wealth gap. I'm not going to go through all 10, but like I think there are some that we need to just take some time to really, really zero in on. And I think the number one, I'm just gonna start off the bat with like what I think is one of the largest ones. And these are myths, by the way. These are things we get wrong. This is a myth. This is something that people say, everybody believes it, and then there's policy shaped around it. That's like the discourse, there's policy shaped around it, but it's never really ever meant to actually achieve anything. And I would say the number one myth is educational attainment. For some reason in this society, we believe that educational attainment is a cure-all or some sort of silver bullet that you just plug somebody into a college, and then like once they have that degree, everything just opens up, and the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, all that stuff just falls right on off of them. They come out clean, and like none of that stuff will ever basically hold them back, and the world is accepting of them, and they're able to do the same things with that degree that other people are able to do with that degree. Since I just framed it like that, obviously that's just BS. It doesn't really work that way. So in the racial wealth gap study, like it straight shows a graph, and it basically says, okay, people, college students who are African American or Black, descendants of slaves, whatever you want to identify as, if they have a college degree, they have less wealth than somebody who finished high school that's white. So if this is really about somebody's individual choice, this is really about human capital, if this is really about somebody's, like whatever they have inside them, their get up and go, their gumption, why is it that Black college graduates, far more educated, they've done more things right, they've checked more boxes, so to speak, why do they have lower outcomes than somebody who's white that has nothing, just barely even finished high school? If that's really what it's about. And then you say, okay, I'm going to ignore that. Well, what about comparing them to their equals? Let's say you compare somebody who has, post college, these are PhDs, MSs and PhDs, the gap is even bigger. So it's like the higher up you went, you were behind the whole way going up the ladder. But the higher up you go, the disparity grows larger and larger. So it's just like between people who are equals, meaning both people have similar qualifications, why is the return on investment for all that time and investment, that a white person may put in, why is the return on investment for a Black person so much lower? And, when you ask why, then you understand that, hey, or even just looking at the data without even asking why, say, hey, well, if these people are both getting education, similar qualifications, right? That's normalized for qualifications. Why is it that the return on investment for one group so much higher than the other? Well, perhaps there is some sort of racial or social aspect that's making the outcomes between these two individuals or these two groups different. And when you say that, that means that when you say things like education is the solution for poverty or education is the solution for the racial wealth gap, you have to say, well, no. We see that the more education you get, the racial wealth gap expands, not decreases. So it's not logical to make such an argument. What do you think about that, Richard?
Well, I think that comes as a shock for a lot of people that are surprised because that's not, as you said, the way that it's usually portrayed when it's discussed or framed in the usual conversation. Everybody's, well, you can't get a good job unless you get an education, so it must then hold that if you get an education, then you'll get a good job and you'll be on par with the people that have gotten the same education. Well, and turns out that when you look at the statistics, which are often hard to come by or have to be tersed or have to be really pulled out of the places in order to get them, because there's a lot of statistics that have been hidden in this country in order to help facilitate hiding something such as this. Anybody that had really been wanting to study the racial wealth gap with any sincerity and clear-eyedness and not without bias, this would have been discovered a long time ago. The reason why this was being discovered recently or being pointed out so poignantly recently is because there was finally somebody with both the qualifications and education and bona fides to get the attention and to have the ability to do it, and they actually cared to look at this particular aspect. And so then we get this information. And so how public it gets and how widely it's spread and how much this affects the big C conversation in the future, I think is going to be interesting. But I have little faith that this is going to be as absorbed as, say, a fact like Russia interfered in the elections. I feel like if you ask somebody questions based around both these facts, one of them is going to be have a much higher probability of being recognized by a random person you run into in the street.
Yeah, and that's speaking to a much larger point, something that we spoke about here before, where we talk about the control the control and distribution of ideas, the control of the distribution and creation of ideas. Like when you have a group that has the ability to control common ideas that are disseminated to the public, like you run into stuff like this. They can basically, propagate mythos like, hey, if you just get a college education, blah 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 blah, everything will be all right. It's like, no, when you see the college education, in comparison to your peer, you really haven't gained anything. If anything, you're much further behind. And so, like, if you're getting a college education as a means to catch up to your peers, the college education really hasn't done that. It's put you ahead of people who should not be competing with you to begin with. Some of them, but in some respects, you're still behind a lot of them too. So, what does that mean?
Yeah, well, and I mean, it also speaks to what I think is a much larger myth that I know myself, and I'm sure pretty much almost everyone has propagated at some point, which is that things have gotten better. And it's when you look at the measurable, anything that we can actually measure, it's like perhaps in polite company, people are less likely to drop racial slurs or overtly racist things, though Trump has kind of shifted that dynamic again. But when you look at the economic indicators, or you look at the social indicators like redlining, or the redlining practices of segregation and so on and so forth, if you look at those, some of them got better immediately following the civil rights era. Some of them didn't get much better at all, really ever, but none of them have significantly addressed the gaps and disparities between black and white people since the civil rights movement. None of those gaps have been significantly closed anywhere, at least as far as I've known. I asked before a lot of people that should know this type of thing, and that nobody really had anything on that front. So if somebody's watching this and can point to, oh, here are some of the places where the disparities between black and white people economically or socially in measurable ways have significantly changed, I'll be happy to recognize them. But as of today, I hadn't seen any. And so...
Okay, and I'll butt in right there and
Go
say,
ahead.
in terms of representation, in some ways, in representation, there have been advances, for Black folks in terms of like social aspects. So you'll see, entertainers on TV and people able to go to the same venues. Basically, the integration is narrative, like that is, that is a real step forward. But that's like basically you've upgraded the front end or the UI or whatever you look at when you're using this. Whatever, they've upgraded what's in front of you, but underlying all of that, it's the same old, same old. But I think there was a commission appointed by LBJ called the Kerner Commission. That commission concluded some conclusions, and there was a new report put out, or a new article put out 50 years after the Kerner Commission. I think on the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission, they put out a report and they basically said, hey, nothing's really changed. So if anything, the argument that you haven't really seen much change has been backed up by a recent report done 50 years after the original Kerner Commission. And that commission also came up with some, strong findings. And I would challenge any reader to go back and take a look at those reports. And so you can kind of like read what was said, 50 something years ago, and find out how very little has actually been done. And the same situation that applied back then is still applying today. The next two myths, I want to tie them together. The first one is saving more. Black people saving more will close the gap. And then the next one says financial literacy. And like I put these two kind of together.
Mm-hmm.
So like these are bad. Very, very bad. Number one, the idea that someone of little means, if they just manage their means better, that they would somehow have more means, is not right. We live in America. We live in a country that's built upon conspicuous consumption. We live in a country where everybody's fed the same narrative that, like, if you don't buy this, you're garbage. If you don't have this, you're not happy. If you don't look this way, you aren't American. Like, there's certain things that you just have to have. And, things like food, clothes, water, all that stuff's been commoditized, right? I mean, excuse me, not commoditized, but commercialized. And so like there's a huge industry in getting people to basically just buy stuff and spend money that they may not even have. But then to blame any group to say that their situation is because they spend too much money when you live in a country that's predicated on extracting money from you is disingenuous.
Absolutely. I mean, you just reminded me of the when they used MLK in that Dodge Super Bowl commercial. I think it was Dodge Super Bowl commercial, and just the, the conspicuous consumption to the level of quoting a man who later in the same, basically in the same speech, was articulating, or maybe in a different speech, was articulating why it was so absurd what the commercial was actually doing, and it's almost magic how they're able to do that, how they're able to reverse narratives, how to split uh, or just completely change what somebody was saying or what somebody represented and use it to exploit and to commercialize and to do all those things. And one thing some people might not know, I recently found this out, so I forgive me if I'm just presuming that other people didn't know this, but there are other countries that do things like ban advertising to children. Like I believe I want to say Switzerland. I always get Switzerland and Sweden mixed up, but I want to say Switzerland, maybe Sweden, bans it altogether. But several countries in the EU have restrictions on advertising, like not advertising food for children during in the middle of their shows and stuff like that. And like lots of countries, we're one of the only countries in the world that allows the advertising of prescription medication. So when you see like from whether it's boner pills or whether it's the restless legs or SSRIs or whatever medication, we're one of the only countries in the world that allows the advertising of that. So like to Nick's point about telling people to save and spend more responsibly, we are drowning in this country in how in order to be a good citizen you have to irresponsibly spend. And so the idea that well, it's their fault for basically being good Americans, that's why they're in the bad situation that they are, it's a very circular and vicious argument in my opinion.
And then on top of that, let's put the data with it. According to this study, for when adjusted for income levels, black people actually spend less than other groups. So we have less and we spend less. Yet for some reason, our spending habits are the source of our problems. Yet we spend less than everybody else, and we have the least, and we're on the bottom. So obviously, our situation and our position isn't just dictated by how much we spend and what we spend our money on. Another thing about financial literacy is like they always want to tell you stuff like buy stock and investing in this and investing in that. Let's talk about stock for a second. Stock is something that's done in scale. So, not buying Starbucks and saving $5 and investing, or even if you have extra means and you're able to invest, I don't know, $100, $200 a month. Like, even if you're investing $200-300 a month, like stock only grows maybe 4, 5, 6%, per year, compounding interest, right? So if you're adding money at $200 a month, you're looking, that's 2,400 a year, like at just a 5-6% interest rate. That's nothing. Like in 30 years, that's still nothing, and that's $200. And for 30 years, that you without whatever you could have used that $200 on, whether it be clothes, whether it be rent, and like in the end, you might have ended up with what, $400,000 or $500,000 after 30-40 years of all straight 6% good years, which you won't get in real life. You'll have like economic crises every decade or so. So like maybe if you time it just right and there's no economic crises for 30 years straight, you'll end up with about 600K or so. I'm just kind of using a number. I can crack out a compound interest calculator and really get down to an exact number for you, but I implore you to do so yourself. You'll find out that the number I used is a reasonable number. You're not even going to have $1 million. And like in America, $1 million is like the culmination of all your life's work is nothing. Like we're living in a place where there's billionaires. And let me point out something. I also want to talk about something also that happened. I should have said this before we even got into the myth argument. That was the main part of the show. But I want to point out, this is a side note. We had a royal wedding this weekend, and I noticed that there was a lot of different comments that I heard. Two comment types. Like, what are these people doing, and why are they so important? We don't celebrate royalty anymore. Royalty's garbage. I agree with that. And then they're like, we don't have royalty anymore. And I look and I was like, well, I don't agree with that. Like royalty is not like a dying off thing. I think we just may have forgotten kind of like how things can change for the time. We have royals. We have royals. You open up Forbes and you look at, all these top 50 and top 100, millionaires and billionaires, multimillionaires and billionaires. Those are our royalty. They don't have the title like king and queen of this country anymore. They have titles like owner of this and this, and investor of that and that, heiress of this and this, heiress of that and that, heir of that and that family, the Johnson and Johnson family, the Walton family, the Hunts. It just goes on and on and on and on and on. The Hildebrands, whatever you want, the Carnegie Mellons, the Rockefellers, all of them. Like those are our royalty. They just don't have the king, queen, and all that. But you guarantee they fall in some kind of hierarchical order based on how much money they have and what industries they own and control. So like those are our royalties. So don't think that just because they don't have king and queen on their title, that means we just have gotten rid of them. They just transform for a new age. And it's by birthright too. You're born into those families. It's straight up just like it used to be.
Yeah. I mean, essentially, it's more of a court without a king. Essentially, is where we generally lie, and that there's usually not an established, agreed upon king. But I mean, there have been, like the Rockefellers for a long time, were essentially, the family, and then in some ways the Waltons act in that way now. But we don't have any of the aristocracy, like the class or the appeal. There's a Johnson and Johnson documentary where they took the I don't mean aristocracy as in the people, I meant as in the attitude and like the pomp and circumstance of being actually classy people or whatever. Like they don't view themselves, in my opinion, in a lot of ways, as setting the types of examples that a lot of European royalty thought they were. Like they were supposed to be better than everybody else because they were actually better. Like they thought they were, exemplifying better public personas. You know what I mean? Like the role models.
I would argue that they're still kind of doing that.
I think
There was a study done on the attitudes, and I think the study is called the pathology of the rich, where like they kind of went into people's attitudes and like how they feel, and like high markers of wealth are accompanied by things like Calvinism, social Darwinism, and increased tendency towards those things, and then also a decreased tendency for things like empathy and socialization. Like, so you have people like Donald Trump that are just so rich that nothing matters to them anymore. Like they don't have to be nice to people because they're so fucking rich. They don't have to care if your dad died yesterday. They want to ask you, do you have my report that I'm paying you to create my report? Do you have it? Do you have it today? Do you have it tomorrow? I'm sorry what happened to your dad, but do you have it? All right, I need to pay somebody else to go get my report.
Yeah, I guess what I mean to say is that like the part that comes to me is like there's a Johnson documentary, the first one, where he talks about the what he's dealing with mentally, more or less, with inheriting the fortune and so on and so forth. He also did a second documentary which has some interesting stuff in it too. It has a quote from Forbes that sets me off. Anyway, but in it there's an aristocrat from a royal from somewhere in Europe, I can't remember where, but the way he talks about how he views aristocracy and their role and their responsibility in the social order is different than I think it's described in American culture, in the sense of he envisioned himself as an actual role model for what people should aspire to be.
And what do you call it when you have these businessmen and entrepreneurs or like celebrities and stuff getting up there talking about how they came up from nothing and like you can do it too, and you have people like Barack Obama and things of that nature. Like, to me, it's a very similar thing.
It's similar, but I don't actually think many of those people actually want you to imitate them. Like that's not
Well,
what,
I mean,
that's not what they want.
but it's a PR thing. I'm
Yeah.
sure back in the day they didn't want you to imitate them either because they weren't working, and you're working. You got to work.
Well, that
They
was
didn't want you to not work. They wanted you to imitate them in some form or fashion, but they didn't actually want you to really imitate them.
fair enough.
But hey,
I mean,
let's
it
just
also
kind of
just
get.
came with like the whole like I have a hard time finding the words to describe it, but just like a classiness, a like a respectability of decency that I don't necessarily think it's any better per se or anything, but it's just it seems different now in that much of American aristocracy wants to throw off the responsibility of being a role model for society. Like they want to be. I just want to not work and do whatever I want and don't care. I don't want people to judge me or to assess what I could be doing with this time, money, and wealth. I don't want them to think about that. All I want them to do is worship me. And I think that is kind of a bit of the distinction is like, no matter what I am, no matter who I am, no matter how I act, no matter how irresponsible or any of those things, like how little I deserve all this stuff that I'm getting, like you guys should just worship me. I feel like that is being more embraced in the American celebrity or American royalty culture than the the aristocracy. And I would say the other style that I described is more common in the business field, where you see that like the true I don't know, the emperors of power, the ones that have the mass that aren't so much socially dominant, but are economically dominant and domineer the social landscape through their economic power.
See, I mean, the ones that dominate the social landscape through their economic power, I think that kind of goes back to Karl Marx. Right now, the reigning material force will also be the reigning intellectual and social force. And I think Antonin Gramsci also said that when you have people that have a sort of hegemonic power to influence culture, they can use that power to sort of like push an ideology onto everybody that's beneath them in that sense. And I think that's kind of what you run into. And I think that's probably what we're running into here with these myths. Myth number 6: entrepreneurship will close the racial wealth gap. Look, when capitalism was started, when people were first moving from feudalism to capitalism, there were two types of people: those with capital and those who had no capital. If you have access to capital, you can become a capitalist. And like I hate to make it sound so bad, but I say it's so simple. But that's really how it works. In our society, in order to be a capitalist, you have to have access to capital. There were times where the government stepped in and provided capital and opportunity for individuals to become capitalists, but that time has come and passed. Now, if you want to revert back to that time, it's going to take a lot of government policy to get there, but we can't act as if that window is just open and it just stayed open for everybody to just jump through, years and years and years later. Times have changed, that window is closed. Right now, we're seeing what's, a lot of people are calling like wealth calcification, where we're seeing like the wealth and the power and all that is kind of calcifying, concentrating and calcifying at the top. And it's like, there's no way for you to really get into that. And I hate to put my hand in front of the camera, but like I talk with my hands. And when I'm doing this show, I try not to talk with my hands. I kind of just want you guys to kind of get what I'm saying without having to look at my hands and be distracted. But that's really what we're looking at. So the idea that you can just go out there and start a business with no capital, you just got no chance. You're like an ant, roaming around. There's like elephants stomping around, and you're just like, oh, if I dodge all the elephants, like I can maybe, eke out something. It's like, no, dude, odds are the longer you're out there, you're just going to get stepped on. That's literally how that works in a competitive society. And we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to be in a competitive society if we can get through some more of these myths fast enough. Myths number 7. Now, this myth, you'd be shocked. I work out with some guys, and I don't know why. Eventually, if you hang out with people long enough, their biases will come out, and they'll make you aware of them. And I know everybody's been a victim of this, where like you just become the person that they just kind of bounce stuff off of to see how it sounds. And if you've identified yourself as racially neutral enough, they will feel comfortable in doing this. And so, generally speaking, they brought this idea that if Black people were to just act like other groups, that we could be better off. And I would say, like, that doesn't make any sense. We're not other groups because we're Black, not because there's something wrong with us, not because we're making wrong decisions. No. We live in a competitive society. Like, one group's failure or one group's position buoys or lifts up other groups. So, like, Black people really are like, if this was like a car, like we're the wheels, we're down at the bottom and we're in contact with the road and we're getting worn out as you stop and go, you freaking nick the curb kind of when you cut you cut the corners or whatever, you kind of nick the curb, mess up your rims a little bit, scratch up your tires, you run over stuff, you hit potholes, you don't slow down. That's black people. We're the wheels, and we get treated like that. Everybody else, you know, white people are more like the person in the car driving it. They control where you're gonna go and all that, and everybody else in between is some varying instrument in between the driver and the wheels. They might facilitate. They might facilitate the car going. They might just be the suspension. So they're there just to buffer, in between the wheels and the person driving the car. But like they're just there as like a buffer zone. If you hit a bump, the black people, we feel the bump, and then the car kind of like, the suspension kind of softens it up a little bit, and the white person riding the car didn't feel a damn thing. That's the way it's supposed to roll. And kind of like, I just feel like, go ahead. I just feel like when you're living in a society like we live in it, like you have to start understanding that like we're all like, interacting with one another. And like when a group is set to be at the bottom, that means other groups don't have to be on the bottom. Other groups can move up. They can be on top of that group. And then, ultimately there's only one group that's standing above all groups. And that group is driving the car. And everybody else in between, like I said, it's just some instrument in between, facilitating and making it happen in some way, shape, or form, because they were willing to integrate into a hierarchy. So the idea that, we're supposed to act like other groups has two problems. Number one, it presumes that we're where we are because we act a certain way. That's already not true. Number two, it presumes that if we were to act like other groups, or that if other groups were to do something different, or other groups themselves are where they are because they act a certain way. And that's also not true. Like both of those things are just not true. There was another one that I was thinking of, but it really ties back to the first. So I'm just going to double down on those two I just said. So basically, other groups are not where they are because of the decisions they make. They are where they are because they're not black. For whatever reason, wherever they came from, or whatever, decided to make things happen originally, there was, a white and a black. And then when other groups started showing up, they decided to say, okay, we're not black, and we'll still be excluded from white, but we're not black. So we'll create some new kind of hierarchy, and you can kind of place us kind of where you want us arbitrarily based on, I don't know what, based on, a random lottery. I don't know what it is, just whatever white people decided it was going to be. That's kind of what happened when it comes to a racial hierarchy. That's how we have a racial hierarchy in America. So the idea that black people can just act like somebody else or do something that somebody else does is fictitious. It's fictitious and specious. It's a specious argument. Like we're designed to be on bottom because we're black, and we were decided to be black based on, some kind of economic or some kind of incentivized behavior long ago that just continues all the way through today.
Yeah, and for there people, black people accepted that argument at one point in time, worked their asses off, built their own, and it was bombed, burned, rioted, killed. It was whatever it took to destroy. So even when black people accepted that proposition, it was completely dismantled systematically by the same white people who then again tell us, well, if you just did that again, this time we won't blow it up, we promise.
Oh yeah, I mean, and then there's a timing to everything, right? Like if you were able to do it when America was still growing and opportunities and the government was supporting stuff, like that's different from trying to do it now where all the wealth is calcified at the top, and like you exist at the you're kind of existing at the leisure of some corporation's willingness to tolerate your existence. If they didn't want you there, then you're gone. Poof. Like sand in a desert, you just kind of get blown away. Like that's literally what happens to you. So I kind of wanted to point that out because that was, I'm sitting here lifting weights and I don't want to talk about this garbage. Like, I'm just focused on doing whatever I'm doing, having a good time talking about life. And somehow that just comes up and I just sit here and I'm just like, you guys just don't have a fucking clue. No clue. And like, in all honesty, I'm at the gym. I've had a long day at work. I'm going to go there after this. I don't feel like having to hold your hand and take you through it.
No, it'd be nice if it was more Matrix style. We could just slip a USB disc or stick into somebody and be like, here's about 150 years worth of history. You just go ahead and chew on that for a little bit and then come back to me.
Oh, like those stupid gum commercials. Like you can just pop them a Mentos or something. They start smiling. Yeah. Yeah. Mentos, the fresh maker. How about that? Mentos, the anti-race maker. Come on.
See, we're writing skits here. Somebody's gonna find that, use it, get paid.
Oh yeah. It won't be us. It won't be us. Of course not. Of course not. I mean, it would be too much like right. Yeah, I think those are the most important ones that I want to hit. like out of this report. And I would encourage everybody to read this one. Oh, and this is the last one. I'll say myth number 10. And the reason why I say this one is also important is because I hear even black people repeat this to me, that somehow the destruction of the black family is the cause of the racial wealth gap. Like if our family structure was strong and stable, like then the racial wealth gap wouldn't be a thing. And I would be like, well, look, black families didn't start decaying till after the 60s. Like before that, we were stably married to one another and we were still poor. The destruction of the black family really is the result of other things that are happening at the same time, and is more of a result of something else rather than a cause of this. Like I think one of the most important markers, it seems as though during the post-war period, you know, marriage sort of was for people who were stable. It became for people who were stable. You had, people, both people working, black people, both people have always worked, but you had people who are working and they have a wealth position, or they have a stable income, a stable life, living, with the white picket fence and whatever else that they got going on. They bought a car, credit was cheap, minimum wage was great, unions were still strong. Like that's really like the environment that's conducive for raising a family. Unfortunately, in America, for the most part, black people don't live that. That's never been our life. We've always been unstable chronically, and we've always suffered from all sorts of systemic ills and consequences from a history of racial oppression that continue to this day. And so when you have that and you're trying to start a family and you don't have what it takes to actually have a stable family, why then would you point to the idea of not having a stable family and say that's the cause of all the other ills, when it's really just a result of not being stable in the first place?
And one of the things, I know there was some studies done recently or not too long ago that showed that like black fathers are often, given circumstances, more engaged in the families than the other fathers of other races when compared straight across, basically. And so that a lot of the idea that the dysfunctional black family is also not true as well, is that black fathers, particularly who we're talking about because they're extracted through the criminal justice system or through the prison or the school to prison pipeline in general. And so the black fathers that are available, even if they're separate or live in separate homes or those circumstances, that when compared to their white counterparts, for example, that they're just as or more involved in their children's lives. And so the myth is, I guess, twofold in that way, and it's also critical in figuring out, well, like, so that we know, well, black families should be strong, as any family should be strong, and we should probably look more into extending our families and less of nuclear families and how that affects society and so on and so forth. But beyond that, that black families are strong enough, and that's not the core cause. And as Nick pointed out, it's more of a symptom of several other things, like one, the systematic destruction of black families several times in this country's history.
Yeah, how can you blame individual actors, or like us collectively, when we live in the shadow of mass incarceration? Like where literally 10% of the black male population is being put in prison, and you're going to say, well, the problem is, we make bad choices and that's why our families aren't whole. It's like we're living in the shadow of mass incarceration, but somehow it's our fault that our families aren't whole. Are you serious? And then look, wait,
Yeah, go
we'll
ahead.
go to the immigration debate, and like people are being deported and they're saying, well, you're breaking up families. But when people were being sent to prison in mass incarceration, nobody said, well, don't do that because you're breaking up families. Nobody said that. What they said was, well, you broke the law. And it's just a weird thing how compassionate people get, when it's a different group. And again, this goes back to the other argument. Why can't we act like other groups? In many ways, we are just like other groups. We're just treated very differently.
And the part of that mass incarceration, it's not, the people say, oh, well, you broke the law. Well, now we know the people that created the laws and started the enforcement deliberately did it to target black people. Like, that was a primary target of who they were targeting with these laws. It had nothing to do with justice, had nothing to do with, society, social ills, or any of those things. It had to do with shutting down a political point of view from a particular group of people, especially those that were black. and police then, in the systemic racism that existed in the country, just proliferated it and made it even worse and expanded it even more. Continued it throughout the 90s with another mass incarceration movement, where they used the same terminology that they presumably knew was created under the auspices of incarcerating political dissent. And so, like, the idea that this is a individual problem of individual behavior is just totally absurd, and it's offensive at this point, in my opinion.
Yeah, and let's also get let's also be let's also be a little bit, let's back up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Let's back up to a little bit. Here's something else that I thought is absolutely weird about that. You know, you're right. Somebody else say, but you know, this is just what the law is. And whenever I say like you can have universal laws that are racially conscious, the opposite is true. You know, you can have universal laws that only target a specific subset of group because you can cater the law in such a way that only only a group fitting a certain situation, or a situation that only happens to a certain group, is the only group that excuse me, scratch everything I just said. I'm confusing you guys with what I'm saying. Give me 1 second. I'm going to say it the correct way so everybody can get what I'm saying. You can cater the law such that it applies to a situation that only a specific group suffers. So, like, let's say, Black people tend to have jobs in the farm industry. You could say, well, hey, Social Security is not going to apply to the farm industry. It's not going to apply to farm industry and like domestic helpers, domestic workers. Well, guess what? That just happens to be all Black people. So now all Black people are just excluded from Social Security. That is a racially conscious policy because you knew what you were doing when you did it. And it just so happens to be that was the policy, the law of the land in the United States. And that was the law of the land for many, many years, until finally people were able to struggle and get that changed. But that literally was the law of the land, a racially conscious law that did a lot of damage. Now, you can also make laws to do the opposite. You can also make laws that do make things better for people who are living in certain situations. And they'll be universal, but if you cater the law correctly, they'll be racially conscious because they actually improve the situation of a group who may be suffering from a particular ill. That's how you make racially conscious but universal laws. Yeah. For good and bad.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of it boils down to a lot of people not wanting to concede resources that are going to disproportionately help Black people, and a lot of them don't want to like accept that, confront it, or deal with it. But a lot of people have the feeling that, well, I can determine better than some third party where my resources should be used if I want to help people in need. So I give to the church that I like because they help the community members that I want to get helped, and so that's better than if I were to contribute towards some larger operation of redistributing wealth towards disadvantaged and oppressed people throughout history.
Well, wait a minute. Mm-hmm. First question I want to ask: who are you? Who are you to decide, who gets helped and who doesn't get helped? No. It doesn't work that way.
In the glorious meritocracy, I have earned every cent. And
yeah, America runs off of preferential treatment and nepotism.
Mm-hmm.
Based on a variety of things. That's the way you get ahead. You either know somebody that's going to hook you up with something, or you're getting preferential treatment systemically. That's America.
You mentioned Forbes earlier, and as Forbes as basically the magazine of American royalty. And there's a quote I mentioned earlier, the heir to the Johnson & Johnson fortune. In his second movie, there's a quote from Steve Forbes quoting his father, who told him, essentially, quote, "There's nothing wrong with nepotism as long as you keep it in the family." And like he proudly said that as he was pointing to the yacht that they expensed on the corporation so that they can entertain wealthy people, and pointed to other wealthy assets that they had that were essentially in the company's name because they were, used to woo other wealthy people to continue their business practices. And so to your point about America being built on nepotism, they're not even really ashamed of it at this point at all. And they just brag about it at this point.
Yeah, I'm just attacking the general meritocratic idea. Yeah. Like that, it's a myth, and like I hate that myth. It's terrible. Like there's a lot of myths that I hate, but that one's pretty bad.
And they love to rub their faces in it.
So many people, and it really doesn't even apply to anybody but like the top, 20-30% of America. In good times, and really, probably the top 15 to 10%. More regularly, right? Because like when things get tight, everybody's kind of starts falling to the wayside, But hey, guys, we've had a good conversation here. I think I've, kind of given you the nuts and bolts of some of the report. I would encourage you to actually take a look at the report because they've got a lot of references in here where you can reference actual data. They got some interesting charts and graphs for you to kind of digest. Like all of it's data driven. So like there's nothing to dispute here. Like this is, a largely data driven report. It's not innuendo. It's not like, I just made this stuff up. It's not fancy wordsmithing. Like this is a hardcore data driven report, and that's why it's really important that we kind of absorb this and understand what it means. Other than that, I think I'm gonna ask Richard if he had anything else to say, and we'll go ahead and close it out.
Just thanks for checking us out and watching, subscribing, sharing the videos when you can, thumbs up, all that good stuff. I really appreciate it. I love having opportunities like this to have conversations with Nick and other people, and when I get to speak with Wendy on Reading Revolution, or with Brandon at Adair at the Discourse and the guests over there, it's all wonderful, and I'm really glad that people are out there listening to this stuff because I think it's critically important. And whenever I turn on the television or I watch a mainstream corporate media report, I see how sorely lacking just substantive conversations on the underpinnings of what the relevance of these news stories are is lacking in the public discourse in the mainstream. And so those people that are craving it and are coming to places like the Takedown with Nick or any of the other places I mentioned, keep doing it and encourage other people to do it because that's where the information is and that's where the conversations are and that's where people are going to start to have the conversations that we're going to need people to have if we're going to improve these situations. Because if you're tuning into those other places and that's your main sources of the real big C conversations, interesting topics about how we are where we are and how we're going to change the current circumstances, episodes like this and other episodes that Nick's done are great examples. And so I just want to thank everybody again and encourage you guys to keep doing it, and give back to Nick for final close.
Yeah, I just want to remind everybody. I know I talk about some of the same things, kind of looping over and over, and I know for the last couple of episodes, I've kind of made a point to talk about our racialized history in America, and that's because I don't believe that until we bridge the gap on kind of reckoning with that racialized history, that we're really going to be able to do what we need to do in terms of tackling some of these bigger issues that we have out there. Because right now, it seems like the progressive community, the Bernie wing, and all that, they're kind of on their thing, and they feel like that's all they really need in order to really tackle what's in front of them. And the problem is, it's not. They need to also have some kind of labor and really a race conscious labor orient that needs to also be there so they can't be divided and then like beaten. And I think, we're seeing that. Like the establishment has been very good at making sure that, progressivism or things that you would tie to progressivism have been mostly separated from like racialized issues in America, except for the low hanging fruit of, mass incarceration. And that just really could be because, conservatives are beginning to sour on mass incarceration because it costs a lot of money. So they rather just, knock those people out of prison, have them out there on the streets, with no jobs, and then, see how that works out. All right. That's pretty much how I can say. I don't want to go off on another tangent about that, but I'll let you guys go. Have a good night, everybody.